Again, welcome everyone to our CoSA member webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Alan Ramsey. Alan?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Can I go next slide, please? Thank you. So welcome everyone. And as Lisa mentioned, I'm Alan Ramsey. I'm with the Connecticut State Library. I'm your moderator for today. Our presenters from the Colorado State Archives today, I'm going to introduce them. I think we go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. First, Ali Jabraki is the State Archivist for Colorado. She has been in this position since 2016. Prior to that, she was the Legislative Audio Archivist for the state and worked in a variety of museums and academic institutions. Outside of work, she enjoys training her dogs in dog sports. We'll also hear from Paul Levitt. Paul Levitt is the records manager for the Colorado State Archives, who just celebrated 20 years of service on May 19th. Congratulations on reaching 20 years. Outside of work, Paul is a professional chauffeur for his son, craft beer connoisseur, and a horrible golfer. Next, I'm introduced Jennifer Simmons. Jennifer Simmons has been the research room supervisor, admin, and official cat wrangler for the Colorado State Archives for about 6 years. She left a decade-long career as retail manager, pursue opportunities in the library and archives field, which led her to start her public service managing the public-facing aspect of the state archives. She has since decided to further education library and archival studies and is currently enrolled in a Master of Library Science program at Emporia University. And we'll also hear from Sam Schiller, who has been the archival collection supervisor with the Colorado State Archives for 3 years. Prior to that, he spent 11 years as the archivist and collection data manager at the Denver Museum of Nature and Sciences. He enjoys databases and cilantro. And with that, I will turn it over to Alec.
Thank you for the introductions, Alan, and thank you to CoSA for having us as well. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation of Surviving Catastrophic Leaks, Our Nightmare Before Christmas. I can't believe that we are close to 1.5 years of passing of the events we are about to tell you about, as it really does seem like it was just yesterday. The story is still an unfinished tale, but hopefully our experiences can provide some beneficial guidance for those in attendance. Sit back, relax, and put on a poncho. Welcome to our horror story. Before we get to the nitty-gritty, I would like to tell you about our building and how we are set up. This will hopefully provide some additional context to the difficulties that we faced. Our beautiful building was built in 1975 and we took occupancy in 76. The building has been, for the most part, unrenovated. There has been some recent upgrades recently, such as a new fire suppression system that spewed glycol all over our Supreme Court collection, but that was not as bad as the story we're about to tell. Our building has a history of leaks due to pipes bursting, clogged French drains, and bad irrigation. Over the 20 years that I have worked at the archives, I would say we average 4 water events a year. Most of these leaks are in the area of 25 boxes being affected. We are spread across 4 of the 11 floors in the building. On the first floor, we have offices and our research room. We are also located on 3 sub-level basement floors as well. The first sub-level has offices, conference room, and a triage and some storage. The second and third levels are all designated for storage. Most of our collections are stored on shelving units and boxes that are stacked double high and double deep. The heights of our shelving can go up to 14 feet, and our aisles are really small, 36 inches, which leads to very cramped spaces and makes our maneuverability of ladders and carts difficult at times. We have zero control of our temperatures and humidity and of the second and third floor storage areas. Upper 70s and low 80s is consistently the temperature, with the humidity in the low 30s. Our collection total is around 56,000 cubic feet at this building, and with hundreds of tubes containing maps, blueprints, and other randomness. Leak number 1. Thursday, December 22nd, Denver's recorded temperature in the morning was a balmy -24. And if I remember correctly, the high ended up being -10. Around 6 in the morning, Capitol Complex, the building maintenance department, emailed Jen and Allie reporting that there had been a leak on 1B and that water did make it to our 3B storage area. But Capitol Complex was on site and cleaning up. Some of our boxes did get wet, but it was mostly from splatter. Capitol Complex did include some pictures in their email to Allie and Jen, and from what was provided, damage was minimal. I agreed to go down to the office and assess the damage, flip out boxes, start drying out records if needed, and such. I arrive on scene and head to 3B. Capitol Complex was still there cleaning. I surveyed the area and confirmed nothing seemed to be too bad. There were more areas that received water damage than originally thought, but nothing horrible. I grabbed a 4-wheel cart to start pulling boxes to take up to our conference room / triage, and since it has the most space and tables to work with. I load up a cart and head upstairs. I get upstairs, enter our space, walk down the hall to the conference room. As I walked into the conference room, I noticed the carpet in the entryway is saturated with water. I pull the cart through and go into the break room that the conference room shares a wall with. The floor was underneath water, ceiling tiles are bulging, and the lights are flickering. I do what any normal person would do and turn off the lights and save the Keurig. Knowing that there are collections below the break room, I head downstairs. I get to the storage area and discover that water is actively leaking onto 3 rows and 3 columns. After a little meltdown, I realize I need to call in some reinforcements and let Jen and Allie know the situation is a little worse than expected and that we are going to need some conservation work most likely. After a little instant messaging, Sam said he was on his way. Contact was made with our conservators, Colorado Art Restoration Services, that we have a working relationship with, and they would be arriving mid-afternoon. In the meantime, I pulled boxes from the active leak out into the hallway while Capitol Complex helped clean up the area and stop the water. Sam arrived and he and I began our week-long love affair with wet cardboard. When the conservators arrived mid-afternoon, we showed them the situation and the numbers of boxes affected. They set up in the conference room to begin the process of switching out boxes for transport to their freeze dryer. Behind the scenes, Jen began her week-long love affair of cat wrangling, by which I mean the point of contact between higher-ups, conservators, Capitol Complex, DoorDash, and insurance. Running low on supplies, we identified the boxes in need of the most attention for the conservators and devised a plan for Friday. Friday was a comparatively calm day that was a continuation of the day before. Sam and I pulled boxes that needed conservation and cleaned up the affected spaces. Conservators continued with reboxing and prepping the records for freeze drying. A lot of work, but things were under control and winding down. An insurance adjuster stopped by and I walked around with him while he took pictures and moisture reading. All said and done, there were 200 boxes that went to the conservator, plus another 200 boxes that we had to move out of danger areas. When we were done, one of the conservators asked if this was the worst leak we had. I said no, but it was top 5. The picture that you see there is a pile of wet boxes that had accumulated during the reboxing on Friday. December 24th, around 3 a.m., while the Colorado State Patrol was making their nightly rounds, they discovered another leak in our building. Capitol Complex was called and we were notified by them at 6:30. Allie sends me a text saying, "Hey, there was another major leak. Can you come in?" My reply, define major. Allie's reply, "Oh, another couple hundred boxes. Sam and Jen are on their way, if not already there." I reluctantly go in, figuring we can assess the situation and take appropriate action fairly quickly, so I can get home and eat some fondue. Upon arrival, I walked into the 1B office area to be met by many fans drying the completely drenched carpet and ceiling tiles that were collapsing. This was a disaster zone. I won't repeat what I yelled out loud, but the PG portion was, this is going to be way more than 200 boxes. From observation and talking with coworkers, water was still actively flowing but slowing down in all 3 storage areas at various locations. Ceiling tiles were covering the floor and records. This was a complete catastrophe. Most staff would arrive around 9 a.m. and a plea for help on a local listserv netted 2 volunteers. Obviously, the conservators were called back in for assistance. The gift that you see is actually of a ceiling tile falling in on one of our records work areas, which is currently being used for a project involving the original state capitol drawing blueprints. Luckily, nothing was damaged. After surveying the storage area and the affected locations, I gave the estimate that over 2,000 boxes had some sort of water damage. But remember, I can't tell what the boxes were like in the back of our double deep storage shelves. State Archive staff began pulling the boxes that were wet and in danger zones. Some of these danger zones were the same as the Thursday leak. How strange. Luckily, we were able to secure more floor space from vacant offices on the first floor to use as our triage area, as the volume we were facing was significantly more than the space we had available. We quickly realized that we were overmatched in resources and manpower. State Archive staff began prioritizing and pulling boxes we knew that had records of higher importance to safety, since we do not know what was in the future. Was another leak going to happen? While State Archive staff moved boxes and such, our department and division leadership, Capitol Complex, and the Restoration Company began devising a plan to handle the destruction when we convened on the 26th. It was now time for some fondue.
And at least we got a Christmas present. No new leaks. The Mike Tyson quote feels like an appropriate summary for the week between Christmas and New Year, insofar as that week was the end of business as usual and was exchanged for near constant problem solving and improvisation. After all, we had emergency plans, we had emergency supplies, we had disaster vendors at the ready, but none of it was enough to prepare us for this event. Up until the 26th, we had been in an emergency mindset where our limited staff was trying to do as much as we could as quickly as we could. We identified the biggest problem at the time, addressed it, and moved to the next one. We had our heads down and were just barreling through the work. The situation was so overwhelming that it was difficult to look past the immediate crisis to do much big picture thinking. We simply pushed through. So by Christmas Eve, we had realized the scale of the damage would be impossible for us to handle ourselves, and planned with the conservators to reconvene the first thing the next Monday morning with more of our own staff and with the additional help of day laborers that the conservators would provide. At this point, we leave the emergency mode and enter the grind. On Monday, the 26th, we resumed operations with the help of about 20 day laborers. And the first big obstacle we had to overcome was shifting our mindset from one of doing all the work ourselves to one of directing the work. We had to relinquish a bit of control in order to get more done. We quickly set up two major divisions of labor, a basement crew and an upstairs team. In the basement, we continued to identify and pull affected boxes. In order to make best use of the extra laborers, Paul and I started using stickers and Post-its to identify boxes and ranges that needed to be pulled. Crews of 2 to 4 laborers would then stack the boxes onto carts and haul them up the freight elevator to the upstairs team. Eventually, some of the laborers also started to learn how to identify problem areas and began to help us with identification as well. It might not seem obvious, but identifying affected boxes got more difficult the further away we got from the initial leak. We could initially identify hotspots by starting in areas where we had previously had standing puddles in the aisles, but by this point, the dozens of industrial fans deployed by the recovery teams had dried up most of the puddles. Worse, many boxes that had been visibly wet or leaking the week before looked normal by the 26th. In order to help with this, our conservators brought some infrared scanners to help identify wet boxes. The idea was you point the laser at the box and it notifies you if the moisture exceeds a certain threshold. That's how it was supposed to work in theory. In practice, they didn't help at all. We would get a negative reading and the front of the box might look dry, but the side of the box might still be visibly wet with wrinkled, sagging cardboard. We were about 4 days out from the leak at that point, so the moisture had begun to dry out on the front of the boxes and would not trigger a positive reading. So we just kept identifying the worst materials we could find at the time, then would circle back around to search adjacent areas above, below, and around the hot spots to see what else we could find. Upstairs, the main operation was reboxing materials and staging them for loading into trucks. Logistically, this involved a handful of folks whose only job was building boxes and lining them with plastic bags. The next table would empty contents of a wet box into a new one, copy down any box numbers onto the new box, and then tape and stack it. Simple enough, right? Now multiply that by 4,000 boxes. A quick note about emergency supplies. Keep in mind that many institutions throughout the Denver metro area suffered losses from this deep freeze, so there was a lot of competition for emergency supplies. Our conservators were buying up all the document boxes their vendors could provide, and they went so far as to go to Costco to buy trash bags and tape guns in bulk. For isolated incidents affecting only your institution, this might not matter, but it's something to keep in mind if you're part of a larger disaster that affects your entire city or region. Next are some photos to give you an idea of what some of this looked like. On the left, we have visibly soaked boxes, some actively dripping, some clearly collapsed. In the top center, if you're thinking, those look like kiddie pools, well, you'd be right. We use actual children's pools on top of our shelves to catch leaks, and ours were working overtime during this event. As another aside, these are effective for smaller leaks, but have you ever tried to empty a full pool that happens to be 8 feet in the air on top of a shelf of historic records? On the bottom center, we have crumbled ceiling tiles from just one of many spots in the basement. And on the right, we have soaked tubes of maps and blueprints in a pool of water. This slide shows just how wet some of the boxes were. If you can't tell, that box is actively dripping. Our shelves are so tight that it was hard to tell what you were going to get when you'd pull a box. And Paul and I each encountered dozens of cases where you'd pull a box only to have a sheet of water run all down your front. We eventually got so drenched we just stopped trying to avoid the water. By the second day, I brought in rain gear from home to wear while we worked the wettest areas. On this slide, on the left is one of many standing pools of water in the basement from the Christmas Eve leak. In the center is a shot of our break room with collapsing ceiling tiles. And on the right is a shot vac on completely soaked carpet. This is a basement conference room that had acted as an initial triage area until we quickly outgrew it. The photo on the left here shows one side of our upstairs area with laborers busily reboxing collections. The top right shows ledgers and bound volumes spread open on the floor to partially dry out until we could get to them. And on the bottom right is trash. The piles of wet boxes accumulated quickly. We filled up our building's standard dumpsters in one load. Fortunately, there were contractors elsewhere in the building doing some major renovations, and they had a giant roll-off dumpster outside that we got permission to use. It was roughly 6 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 15 feet long. You can see that dumpster on the bottom right. We filled it completely every day, and we could have easily filled it 2 or 3 times per day had we been able to get it emptied fast enough. Besides the lack of Wi-Fi and phone signals underground, there were other communication barriers we did not anticipate. The day laborers that our conservators brought in were fantastic and helped us accomplish in 1 week would have easily taken us a month to do by ourselves. They were friendly, helpful, and dedicated. That said, they were not native English speakers, and neither our staff nor the conservators knew much Spanish, so we had to be very patient. We had a few laborers whose English skills were better than our Spanish skills, but communication remained a challenge. Paul had the good idea of simply typing up a set of instructions, running it through Google Translate, and bringing printouts to hand off to the teams. This was great for specific tasks, but trying to solve problems and communicate them in real time was difficult. Since the phone signals and Wi-Fi were non-existent in the basement levels, there was no way to run a quick translation on the fly. We made prodigious use of bad Spanish and hand signals. Still, given the circumstances, we were able to communicate basic themes fairly well. Overall, it was a long and exhausting week, made tolerable by catered lunches, great help, and the gallows humor of our colleagues. And now I'm going to hand this off to Jen to talk about what happens after the papers have been pulled and reboxed.
The last steps in the process of addressing our flood was getting the newly boxed product frozen. This amounted to palletizing boxes, 45 boxes to a pallet, and getting those pallets onto refrigerated trailers. The conservators were instrumental in acquiring trailers, pallets, and supplies throughout the week when these things were hard to find. Trailers especially, as many of them were sent down south for the weather challenges there. Conservators managed the temporary workers well during the week. However, it was clear that shipping and logistics was not their strong suit. The conservators were having a hard time teaching temp workers about things like building pallets, and the overall workflow was inefficient with workers standing around waiting for directions or unsure of what to do. In other places, too many temp workers were working on the same thing and getting in each other's way. This was made more difficult as a forklift was not delivered to us until the middle of the day Thursday, 6 full days after the major leak started. Luckily, our staff had a few employees with previous retail and warehouse experience, including myself and our division director. We stepped in and got that system running smooth. Our division director taught the temporary workers how to build a pallet in 3 minutes. When we didn't have a forklift, they built the pallets inside the trailers. And when we did get a forklift, they built them just outside the doors of the building for faster results. Our division director even drove the forklift when no one else could. What originally was taking 2 hours to build and load a pallet now took 20 minutes. I managed the workflow of getting the boxes to the pallet builders, coming up with a system using only one other temporary worker to stage 45 boxes, have the conservator take photos of the box numbers that corresponded to each pallet, then load a pallet's worth of boxes onto 3 flatbeds for temporary workers to take to the pallet building area. As they were going out, 3 empty flats were coming back in, and the process repeated. We were lucky in that we had some employee-only parking lot space right next to our building that could fit a semi. So we were able to move the newly boxed records out to them without dodging traffic or traveling over grass, filling one semi after another. All told, we filled 4 53-foot refrigerated trailers that got parked in a lot elsewhere in Denver, the only thing keeping our records stable. Paul, Sam, and I have been talking so far about what we needed to do in terms of the collection, what happened, how the collection was affected, and what staff and vendors did to address the emergency as best we could. However, I was also involved in a different way than the rest. Admin duties. You may have got the gist from Paul's comments earlier, but I am a professional cat wrangler. That came in handy in the situation. I often stepped away from the main action for a variety of administrative reasons. To consult with a conservator, building maintenance crew, and other decision makers on the best way to cool and dehumidify the space without breaking more pipes, speaking with the stake architects and building crew on emergency funding decisions, getting additional space open for triage, prepping lunch, drinks, and snacks for the team. And let me tell you, the vending machine was devoid of water and Mountain Dew when I got done with it. And generally be the main contact and middleman for anyone needing questions answered, decisions made, or updates so the team itself could keep working. There are many things to keep in mind during an emergency that could help or hinder your process to save your collection or mitigate damage. One of the big ones is knowing who your decision makers are, not just for what to do with the collection, but for administrative approvals. We all work in government, and we all know everything needs a form signed or an approval given. So, who can approve overtime or emergency funding or the buying of lunch? Who can get you into other spaces in your building to stage boxes? Who's your insurance agent? Even if you don't have all the answers, make sure you know who you need to ask or alert to the situation and alert them right away. Do not wait until it is over, or you could face fiscal or legal ramifications, like our learning opportunity of spending approved money but out of the wrong place. One of the perks of our situation was that our approving authority, our division director, was working right alongside us. So I was able to partner with him quite easily on quick approvals for overtime and buying the team lunch. Another person to know and contact is your media liaison. How the media gets wind of something so quickly usually amazes me, and we had news articles and videos of our flood posted on Colorado Public Radio, CBS News, and Denver 7 local news. I was our liaison's contact for updates on the scope of the event and the work we were doing. But don't worry, after the emergency part is done, there's more. Once our collection was stable and frozen, the emergency was over. This meant that ongoing restoration required an actual bid to contract out the additional work. This means drafting a request for proposals, going through the bid process, drafting a contract, all the while making sure your insurance agent is involved. These things take months no matter how fast you try to move. Our water event started on December 22nd of 2022, and our contract for ongoing restoration was signed on June 26th, 2023. Then there is the public side. Our archives takes in about 4,000 requests for records a year from not only the general public but also businesses and state and local government agencies. As the research room supervisor, I also have the task of drafting communication to use when a request was made for a record now frozen and in need of restoration. A large percentage of our requests are for documents that people need to access state and federal services. Things like getting a driver's license, applying for Social Security benefits, or getting dual citizenship to other countries. So I drafted not only communication about the flood itself, but an official letter we send to anyone needing records for official business. Since the event, we receive an average of 3 requests per month for records that were impacted. We've talked about what happened and what we did during our nightmare before Christmas, but we also wanted to leave you with our takeaways, both what we learned for the future and what did go well for us. Here we have a quote from the great Paul Levitt: "When your Home Depot bucket ain't worth a damn." I'm sure many of you watching have those 5-gallon bucket flood kits that have some paper towels and plastic. Well, those won't come in handy when a waterfall is pouring on top of hundreds or thousands of boxes. Our flood supplies were laughable compared to what we would have actually needed, and has spurred us to seek alternatives for the future. And speaking of supplies, those should include things like gloves, rain jackets, boots. These things we also did not have, which meant staff got wet and cold when going outside and uncomfortable during the long week. We did have water detection kits, but as you can see in this picture, since the water didn't quite reach them, they didn't actually help. Also, no one would have been in the building that day anyway to hear the alarms go off. We are looking at alternatives now. Moisture and infrared readers were also not as effective, as Sam mentioned earlier. While they may have worked better during smaller events that can be handled in a shorter amount of time, they were ineffective after 5 days when things started to dry out but still needed restoration. By that time, the staff's eyes were a better tool to determine what boxes were affected. Our building is not the greatest for phone and Wi-Fi. The basement levels are concrete and metal, which inhibit many communication tools. The conservator did bring in radios, which worked relatively well, but less so on the very bottom basement. We are now looking into expanding our Wi-Fi and possibly adding cameras, but these are expensive endeavors and may be several years down the road before we can make that happen. Our building HVAC systems also work to our disadvantage, as Paul mentioned in the very beginning. Our building is older and unrenovated, and the basement levels can get hot and humid all on their own, with temperatures in the 80s and humidity in the 30s. And this just exacerbated the situation, making the humidity spike to record levels and requiring dehumidifiers and fans in vast quantities. Temporary workers and conservators were instrumental to our success throughout the week, but logistics experts, they were not. They set up the reboxing area well, but didn't plan for the trash. As I mentioned previously, getting reboxed items onto pallets and loaded into trailers was also not their strong suit. And just because you rent a forklift, it does not mean it comes with a driver. The photo you see here is our division director driving the forklift, which was great because if I had to, the insurance company probably would not have covered the inevitable property damage caused by my horrific driving. And lastly, we had some learning opportunities about the collections themselves. Did you know stickers fall off boxes when wet? Well, they do. We have several boxes where we will have to wait until it gets back before we can verify what is in it. There were also boxes where the original numbers were difficult for temporary workers to transfer to new boxes, either because they were illegible or because there were multiple numbers on the same box, like a case number range, and they did not know which ones were useful to write down. You will also want to make sure that those who are transferring any information to the new boxes is also legible. And the last learning opportunity I will share is that we did not really know where to prioritize our time. We do not have 100% intellectual control over our holdings. It's something that we are working towards every day and getting closer and closer, but we're not there yet. So we didn't have a set plan of what needed prioritizing. We were drinking from the fire hose at the start, and there was so much to do. We found documents that were of historical importance late in the week, some of which were put into our break room food freezer and given to conservators separately to mitigate as much damage as possible. So now that we've gone over what some of our learning opportunities are, I'll hand this over to Allie to talk about what actually went well during the week and where we are right now in this process.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Make my text bigger. Okay. It's usually hard to notice the good in moments of crisis, but we're so thankful for a few things that made dealing with this situation possible. First, the team. Over the past few years, the archives has made a push for hiring more creative problem solvers that don't get overwhelmed easily. We've done this through asking tailored questions during our interview process, and it's really helped not only in this incident, but with overall program growth and morale. The team was able to maintain a sense of humor while rolling up their sleeves and putting in the hard work. Whenever the hiring committee is reviewing applicants, a point of discussion is how do we feel the applicant would handle a stressful situation. We not only relied on the skills of archivists with safe document handling, but some of the team had experience in retail and warehouse management. This skill set allowed them to think about efficiencies in workflow and logistics. Don't be afraid to hire folks for your team that might not fit the traditional mold of a record professional. Having some folks who are detail-oriented and some that think more broadly will help in challenging times. The ultimate goal is to create a team that can handle whatever life throws at them and learn and adapt to a variety of circumstances. Personalities that complement one another with varied work and life experience can go a long way when things get tough. Staff also had to work together on smaller leaks in the past, which gave them some experience for dealing with floods, although not on a catastrophic level such as this. Next, having food and beverages provided for the team was another asset. Thank you, DoorDash. I was actually out of town for the holidays, but even from 1,500 miles away, I could still send some food. Putting an SOS call out to the local Society of Rocky Mountain Archivists listserv resulted in 2 skilled volunteers who were able to help assess records for water damage and move them safely. These volunteers did not need any training since they were already record professionals. Even on Christmas Eve, 2 members of the executive team came in to schlep wet boxes and help us. Once the holiday was over and more people returned to work, we were inundated with offers of help, but at that point the day laborers had been brought in and things were mostly handled. Another good thing was the fact that a large percentage of our shared building was empty due to a majority of state employees now permanently working from home. Capitol Complex was able to unlock the doors for us to use those spaces. Without them, there would have been no place for staging. The freight elevator, which is notoriously broken, was fully operational. This allowed for multiple carts to be pulled from the basement up to the first floor staging area at a time. And the biggest miracle of all is somehow we seem to have avoided mold growth in the space or on the records. Another good thing was that we had just completed a rough box level inventory of the collection a few months prior. While we're still working on more details, if this had happened a year earlier, we really would have had no idea what was in most of the boxes without consulting outdated paper record ledger books. As the wet, soggy boxes got rehoused, the box number was written on the new box before being stuck on the pallet. Before the pallets were wrapped and put in freezer trucks, the conservator took photos of all the boxes so we could identify them later. The report from the conservator also included what pallet numbers the boxes were on, which helped us maintain some semblance of intellectual control throughout the event. Additionally, we really cannot be any more appreciative of all the other administrative offices at the state that worked with us. It was a huge learning curve for all of us, but every single person we worked with was empathetic and tried their best to answer questions, point us in the right direction, or push for faster turnaround times with various approvals. One thing that has helped, even though it can also be an annoyance, is to include everyone you can think of on email chains. You never know who might have the answer to someone else's question, and it really helped us get some answers quickly. There were several questions that I thought for sure our budget analyst would answer, but instead it was our accountant, or vice versa. Insurance also has a knack for asking questions that us at the archives are unable to answer, and we frequently needed to reach out to procurement or legal for their advice. Lastly, if you've never gone through a government bid process, you are in for a real treat. Make sure you familiarize yourself with any fiscal rules or regulations your office has to comply with, and be prepared to have to explain them to the various parties. The state's risk department was unfamiliar with the bid process because most state insurance claims are for building or vehicle damage, which have a much higher exemption threshold and their own fiscal rules. While Archive was fairly certain this was going to have to go out to bid, Risk was already working with insurance to locate vendors for restoration, which was a big whoopsie. Insurance was completely unfamiliar with the process and frequently was getting ahead of themselves, while we had to work with procurement on writing a scope of work and getting the bid published. Thankfully, the archive team was already familiar with the process since we've had bids for other services like our digital repository and collections management system. Whatever you do, make sure again that all even potentially relevant parties are included on all emails and meetings regarding this process. Once the bid was published, we reviewed all the offers and selected a vendor. We're in the home stretch, or so we thought. What followed was almost 2 months of contract negotiation, where Archive was unable to communicate directly with the vendor without legal representation present. The contract was constantly being reviewed and rewritten, as a compromise had to be agreed upon that fit not only the state's fiscal rules, but also insurance processes and the vendor's needs as well. One of the major sticking points was insurance not wanting to approve the contract until they knew how much it was going to cost. But of course, we had no real idea of the full extent of the damage, and the vendor was unable to give us an exact cost until the records had gone through the first few stages of restoration. We ended up settling on a contract that gives an initial cost for the freeze drying and assessment, and option letters will be written for each additional step, with estimates provided as they are determined. Along those lines, insurance was not going to issue the state a blank check for the restoration of the record, but the vendor wanted to make sure that they will be paid once work is completed. Since state fiscal rules will not allow for any services to be prepaid, our accountant had to work their magic to encumber the funds temporarily from the state disaster fund, which will later be reimbursed by insurance. Of course, the bid process we were working through was just for the restoration of the record, not any damage to the facility. Cap Complex had its own fiscal rules to comply with, since anything relating to the building itself falls under their purview. There was also confusion on their end with initial walkthroughs, with a vendor saying they would be completing demolition and remodel within a few months. That sounded too good to be true, and sure enough, only the demolition could be completed to minimize the chance for mold. All remodeling and repair work had to go out to bid, and they started in December 2023, a full year after the flood. At this point, the majority of the work has been completed, but one storage area is still under construction due to asbestos abatement. All of this was just another reminder that as government employees, we need patience and resilience. Everything is going to be trickier than you think it's going to be. Everything. To recap, here is a slide of some statistics relating to the flood. 518 ledger books, 141 tubes, and 3,427 boxes were impacted, filling 4 semi-trailers. About 1,200 hours of personnel time that should have been spent working on other projects. 262,000 in initial emergency funds spent just for the immediate salvage, and over 3 million in growing for freeze drying and restoration costs. Only 47 requests out of the 4,000 requests received since December 2023, but those 47 requests are delaying important processes for individuals such as dual citizenship requests and probate proceedings. Some of these customers are at over a year waiting, when our normal turnaround time is 2 to 3 business days. So where are we now? After the records were initially placed on freezer trucks, we realized the cost to fuel those trucks was going to be astronomical while we waited months for the big process to be formalized. The suggestion was made to look at freezer warehouses, which we were initially horrified by. Food next to archival records, but what we soon found out was that because there is food storage, the warehouses have to comply with regular strict food safety inspections. The risk of pests was actually lower than at a non-food storage warehouse. Additionally, the food warehouse was able to seamlessly track provenance of the record at each stop and had security processes in place to ensure nothing was tampered with. After a lengthy bid process with contract negotiation, the contract with the restoration vendor was signed, records were picked up and transported to Pennsylvania for freeze drying, and are now in Dallas for further restoration. As of early May, all the freeze drying of the records has been completed, and an inventory of records that needed additional restoration was completed as well. We've been informed that nothing is a total loss, and the quick response by the team most likely saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in claims. Currently, we are in the final stages of negotiating the final contract, and records should start being returned this summer. We are working on a new building request and currently have a joint facility proposal in the works with our colleague, the History Colorado, the state's historical society. We're hoping attention gleaned from this flood will help it gain some traction, but it's not looking good with the current budget climate. In the meantime, we have secured additional temporary space in our existing building that is not in the basement, but can only store a couple hundred linear feet. Since we're still in the space, we've had several more small floods since this one, several being sewage leaks from an upstairs bathroom. There have also been water leaks caused by ongoing construction projects. Thankfully, no collections were impacted and staff had already vacated the offices under the sewer leaks. We were hoping for funding for increased Wi-Fi, security cameras, water absorption mats, flood diverters, and more flood response kits, but unfortunately our request for a budget supplemental and decision item was denied. Now we realize that our situation was unique, and we hope that everyone else's buildings set up to properly store archival materials. Records are not on your pipes or in basement where water can run to. But just in case, we prepared a little checklist that you can use to evaluate your own disaster plan. You can either scan this QR code or feel free to email any one of us with questions. Thank you so much for your time, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have now.
All right, thank you, Paul, Sam, Jennifer, and Allie. That was, having gone through some roof leaks and things myself, it's a lot of work. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the freezing of the wet records and the process and rationale for doing that.
That for me? All right, I can try to answer it. So the rationale behind it, I believe, is to just really stop any what's the word I'm looking for?
Old growth.
Thank you. Yeah, anything from getting worse. It just kind of freezes everything in time. So especially with water damage, it helps you when you go to thaw it out, you can freeze dry it and remove the moisture without the paper getting as wrinkly and all that. But it really just kind of stops all the damage before you can properly assess it and do whatever other restoration or conservation you need to.
Who did you mentioned with the freeze drying that so you sent stuff to Pennsylvania?
Yes, the vendor that ended up getting our restoration contract, they have offices in several different locations, and the freeze drying location was in Pennsylvania.
I know you also mentioned mentioned about not having enough supplies. So I was just curious, what sort of things have you thought about since then about having, it's always a delicate balance, because I know here too, it's like you want to have lots of supplies, but at the same time, you have to put a lot of money for that, or you have to have room for that. So I'm just wondering how you've kind of thought about that since the event.
So the big thing that we were looking at, not everything was funded through a decision item like we were hoping, but what we're still looking at are getting more water absorption mats and like what are they're called, like pigs,
Yeah.
water diverters to help
Yep.
move water into the drain areas. So those are things that we're able to stock up on that aren't taking up that much room.
Mhm.
We're also trying to put some supplies on the upper shelves. So We ideally don't like to have archival records on the top shelf anyways, but our space needs we're very, very tight. But we are trying to, as we're completing our inventory, trying to assess like, okay, which of these collections can we potentially move to one of our offsite facility or whatever.
Mhm.
We can use those top areas for supplies. That's at least a place to put them. Granted, if we have another waterfall come down, some of that stuff might get damaged, but at least that's more easily replaced. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of mentioned briefly, in the talk that we're, looking for other sort of preventative measures in terms of monitoring. And, it's again kind of repeating some of the themes from the talk, but to kind of put it all together, we can't do any of that stuff until we get Wi-Fi. So we're looking at, trying to get approval for, $30,000-$40,000 to add either hard cables or Wi-Fi repeaters down in the basement. That's not successful yet. If we can get that approved, then we've also been looking at systems where we could have cameras and/or humidity detection, other sorts of environmental monitoring that could send something to like, a dashboard that we could watch from our computer or even from home, or even send alerts. But again, we've got no approval for that stuff. And so we're probably, months or years out from having any of that sort of stuff approved.
Yes, and Mary Dunn chat said Big Socks and the big floor squeegees were the MVP's most valuable products when we had the minor flood last year. Yes, definitely. We've been using diverters here as well. I know that that mention of absorbents, and absorbents have been a big help here as well. One other thing that I found I really like that you mentioned was having various staff with different skill sets. So I was wondering as a follow-up, you mentioned in the interviews you're looking for candidates like that, and we've been talking about hiring this year as one of our some of our webinars. Do you have specific questions, or is it just sort of gauged based on the interviews? I know in interview, we're starting to think about that here, about incorporating like a specific question about how people have handled disaster response or crisis response.
Yeah, we have come up with some questions that we tend to use a lot. And I know Jennifer, you'll probably remember these a little bit better than me right now. But we do ask some sort of question around have you ever had to take over a project without any instruction? What did you do? How did you tackle it? We found that that's a really enlightening question to ask people, because either they kind of panic and like, oh, well, I looked at a manual and I looked for this. I was like, well, good luck. There's probably not a manual. We've asked, have you ever had to enforce a policy that was unpopular? How did that go? And what was, what was the outcome
Right.
there? What were some of the other ones, Jen? You remember?
I don't know if this is one you just said, but what do you do when faced with many hurdles? Because disaster planning is basically hurdle after hurdle after hurdle after hurdle. So understanding how people problem solve and how they approach situations that are not something that is smooth sailing is really helpful to know. So that's usually a good one. I think coordination with other people. So even doesn't really matter who you are when you're addressing a disaster, you're constantly kind of getting pulled in multiple places, and you're having to answer different questions, and you're having to get pulled a little bit. So knowing how people, examples of when people have successfully coordinated with other people on projects, or literally asking them, have you been a part of a disaster, and what did you do, and how did that work? So that's also a nice one to ask, to see how people have worked in the past with other people. People with different backgrounds come at problems and come at hurdles and come at coordination different than, we all kind of focus on that a little bit differently. So that's also a nice question to add in there with the idea of like the teamwork aspect.
And Cassidy here asks, was it determined what the cause of the leak was?
In short, I think it was HVAC, but you know, I don't ever think we got a straight answer. I think Paul might be able to correct me here. I think there were at least two different failures, you know, because we had a few different leaks. So we had that initial cold snap, and then there was some HVAC equipment on the roof where I believe some coils froze, caused the initial leak. And then we were short equipment at that point, and so the remaining equipment was having to work extra hard to maintain temperature the next few days and caused other things to fail. And again, I don't think we ever got a full download of all the things that failed, but most of it seems to be HVAC related, as I recall.
I think part of it was that broken air handler that's been decommissioned since 1982 that we were trying to get fixed for many for many years. But it was you know, we lost the battle when it come to, you know, ranking repairs of state buildings. So so yeah, it was that plus the frozen coils on the roof and everything having to work overtime, and it just all snowballed.
Seeing any other questions in the chat? So I'll turn it over to Lisa unless there's any last minute questions that come through.
Well, if there are, we'll be glad to answer them or give them to the panelists. But we hope you found this an interesting webinar. Just May is our nod to disaster preparedness because of our May Day push to take a look at what's happening in there. And a couple of things that you guys may have seen notices on. I didn't put a slide in here, but there have been a couple of notes to our community about a tabletop exercise book that's available that might be useful if you've never been through one of these or you want at least to have a chance to walk through. That's a good resource. Our prep envelopes, the template has been updated slightly, not the part where you collect all of the phone numbers for the people you need, but just some of the stuff on the back, the suggestions and other contacts, those had to be updated based on retirements and changes, etc. So there are new templates out there. So if you've got an old template, you know, again, your phone number part, that's still perfectly fine. If you used any of the other parts of it, you may want to look at what the new template looks like. So with that said, and Joanne asked, will the recording for this be available? I would love all of our staff to watch. Yes, it takes us a few days to get these posted. Becky will send a notice out, but it will be available for anyone to view. So yeah, great job to the Colorado team for taking this for us. And so if you enjoyed this, we hope that you will check us out for some more member webinars. Next month is going to be part 3 of our hiring at the archives. We're going to talk about internships. In July, we're going to take a look at probably a CoSA NARA webinar. And then August is going to be First Amendment auditors. So you can go check out our the linking for those. CIRI continues to have great webinars as well. They just finished their unconference last week, so they don't have anything on the books just yet, but go check them out for some other interesting webinars. As always, it's easy to contact us at CoSA. Lots of great ways, and we hope you'll use whichever are appropriate for you. None of our work could be done without some of our funders. We have a couple of grants going on from these 2 institutions. And of course, all of our sponsors make it really possible for us to continue to do the work of CoSA. So we thank them greatly for their help. So with that, thank you all for joining us today. and we appreciate your feedback. So there will be a short survey. We hope you will take a minute and answer it. It really does help us as we're planning future webinars. So if you have topics or suggestions, we'd love that too. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you at the next CoSA webinar. Thank you so much.